Great. Good morning. Thank you all for joining today's press briefing with Generations United. My name is Mandy Rivera, and I will be moderating today's call. All participants are muted to reduce background noise. And please note that this call is being recorded and will be made available later today. Today's briefing will consist of prepared remarks by our panelists, followed by a Q&A. If you are not there already, you'll see a bubble at the bottom of your screen where you can ask questions in the Q&A box. Please ask questions using this feature. We'll be gathering questions throughout the call and answering them at the end. In the current COVID-19 pandemic, adults over the age of 60 and people with compromised immune systems are asked to isolate themselves and not have contact with children and young people. This is not possible for the 2.4 million grandparents in the United States who are primary caregivers for their grandchildren. As the pandemic continues and schools begin to reopen in person or virtually, caregivers are experiencing increased anxiety about what this will mean for their ability to keep themselves and their families safe and healthy. On today's call, we will be hearing from several individuals. Jaya, Deputy Executive Director of Generations United, a national organization dedicated to improving the lives of children, youth, and older people, will provide an overview of the challenges faced by families during COVID. We will then hear from three remarkable caregivers, Gail Engel, Marissa Gonzalez, and Sarah Smalls, who will share their experiences before opening up the lines to questions. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the call over to Jaya, Deputy Executive Director at Generations United. Jaya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manny. As Manny indicated, during the COVID-19 pandemic, adults over the age of 60 and people with compromised immune systems are asked to isolate themselves and not have contact with children and young people. But this isn't possible for the 2.4 million grandparents who have responsibility for raising their grandchildren. In fact, nearly 2.7 million children are being raised by grandparents or other relatives with no parent in the home. And we refer to these families as grandfamilies or kinship families. And grandfamily caregivers are often older or may have underlying health issues, placing them at higher risk if they're exposed to the virus. As the pandemic continues and schools begin to reopen either in person or virtually, grandfamily caregivers are experiencing increased anxiety about what this will mean for their ability to keep themselves and their families safe and healthy while ensuring that the children get a quality education. So even under normal circumstances, being a grandparent or another relative caregiver is a significant challenge. We see that parental substance use is among the most common reason these caregivers are raising their relative children. But in addition to that, mental health, death of a parent, military deployment, and a host of other issues. Many grandfamilies are formed after children have experienced significant trauma. These children are more likely to have been exposed to multiple adverse childhood experiences before they come into the care of relatives. And as a result, they often come with behavioral and mental health challenges and special needs that the grandparent or other relative caregivers are responsible for helping to meet. In the midst of the opioid crisis, we've seen a dramatic growing reliance by the foster care system on grandparents or other relatives to care for children who can't remain with their parents. In fact, in 2008, 24% of children in foster care were with relatives, and that number bumped to 32% in 2018. Now, this is actually good news for children in terms of being placed with relatives instead of non-relatives, because we know that children raised by relatives who have the support that they need have better mental health and behavioral health outcomes and stability than children who are raised in foster care by non-relatives. But grandfamilies do need support. For many grandfamilies before the pandemic, support groups have been their lifelines. It helped keep them from feeling isolated and helped them learn about how to access help and how to navigate complicated systems that would otherwise leave them behind. And now, in their time of greatest need, they are often even more disconnected from their support groups and support systems. More support is needed now, not less. Many grandfamilies are now having to navigate two crises: the crisis that brought the children into their care in the first place and the COVID-19 pandemic. And they're having to do it in many cases alone. We see these caregivers as first responders, the first line of defense for the children in their care. Without these relatives stepping in to care for children, the foster care system would be completely overwhelmed. And the support that caregivers provide helps not only keep children with family, but also amounts to savings to taxpayers of more than $4 billion each year by keeping children out of the foster care system. They're facing a host of unique issues in this pandemic. Many are struggling to get basic supplies because they typically need to leave their home to get things like food, school meals for children, medicine, and other necessities, and that places them at greater risk of exposure to the virus. These families are struggling financially. Many already lived on fixed incomes that can't accommodate increased expenses, and many of those who are working have lost jobs. Before the pandemic, it was common for families to use retirement savings to pay for the basic needs of their children. Now they're struggling as they see these savings plunge. And for them, the loss of these savings is not just about themselves, but it's also about their ability to feed and clothe the children in their care. So now as schools begin to reopen this fall, we see a new set of challenges rapidly emerging for these families. Many caregivers don't have access to or are not comfortable with the technology that's required for children's remote learning. In many cases, acquiring the technology and the internet capacity for remote learning is an additional financial burden for the caregivers. Additionally, we've seen schools that have announced hybrid learning plans or haven't announced their reentry plans yet, and that creates an extra layer of anxiety and uncertainty as caregivers work to manage not only the logistics involved, but also the potential of exposure to the virus. This on top of the ever-present reality that they need to establish contingency plans or alternative care for children to make sure they don't end up in foster care if caregivers die or become too sick to care for the children. These caregivers are strong, resilient, and deserving of our attention and support during this extremely difficult time. I'm glad to have the opportunity to hear from some of our caregivers today, and I hope that this helps to illustrate to you the gravity of the challenges that they face. And now I'll turn it back to Manny to introduce our first caregiver.
Thank you, Jaya. Next, I'd like to introduce Gail Engel, a grandparent caregiver, a Grand Voice member, and a founder of the Grand Family Coalition. Gail is also a child welfare activist, and she's from Loveland, Colorado. Gail?
Good morning, everyone. I am a grandparent raising my grandchild. My grandchild has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, autism, intellectual developmental disability, and cognitive function disorder. So he comes with his own set of challenges as it is. So I am one of many uncertified kinship care providers. That means that we had no involvement with the child welfare system and therefore have very little to none financial support from the state. When I took on my grandchild, I was in my early 50s. I thought that there was not going to be a problem raising this child. And now in my mid 60s, it's become even more of a challenge. With COVID, that causes another layer to me. I am an older adult. My husband and I both have immune compromised systems. We have a child in the home, and if I send him to school, that will mean that he will possibly bring that COVID back to me in my home, which has made it very difficult for us to make that decision to isolate ourselves from our friends and family, which has become very challenging. It's also become very challenging for him because he wants to be in school. He wants to be able to see his friends. I have to make that choice between sending him to school or keeping our family safe. With COVID, the mental health of our families has become very challenging, and also with our own children. So our children are feeling that struggle. The schools are unprepared to handle our children. They don't know how to handle school to begin with. And now with schools shut down, they're trying to scramble, trying to find how they're going to support these children. Those children with special needs are the ones who are really going to struggle the most. This is something different for all of us. It's different for the schools as well. But being able to provide those supports that the special education children need, they don't know what to do. Many of these children, such as mine, is not able to see himself on a computer screen, to be able to interact. He does not learn by putting a classroom on a computer screen. He barely can learn by giving him a document to read. So I have become not only his parent, but now I am his teacher, his special education teacher, his counselor, his therapist, all while working full time. This is even a bigger challenge than I ever thought I would take. Knowing all of this, I also support other grandparents raising grandchildren with support groups, which COVID isolated our grandparents even more because they can't see each other one-on-one. They are struggling with the same thing. So we've created Zoom meetings, and it's helpful, but we also know that we're in this for a long haul. This is not going to be over soon. So those are the struggles that I am facing. I don't know what's going to happen to my child. I'm scared that he's going to fall through the cracks because he is already a child with disabilities that is not going to have support. And now the supports are even less. So I will turn this back over to Manny. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you so much, Gail. Now I'd like to introduce Marissa Von Zyl. Marissa is a member of the Sakaugan Chippewa Band of Lake Superior Indians, a member of Generations United Grand Voices Network, and a relative caregiver. Marissa, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here with you. So how I started out becoming a relative caregiver was through my work. I was an Indian child welfare worker, and I just caught wind of a child that was going to be abandoned at the hospital. And shortly after finding that out, I found out that he was actually my cousin. So my son's been with me since birth. And we knew before he was born that his mother was a carrier for Duchenne muscle dystrophy. And so about 2 months, when my son was 2 months old, he was diagnosed with Duchenne muscle dystrophy. So just right from the get-go, before my son even came into our home and became part of our family, we already knew that it was going to be a challenge. And on top of that, just based on the area that we live in, which is the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, that a lot of things that we need are not going to be right in our community. And so we knew there was going to be so many different challenges based on where we lived, what types of supports we had, because of my son's medical condition. And so now with the COVID epidemic, it's really been a very positive and negative challenge at the same time, because we already know how to survive with limited resources, with limited money. We already know how to do this. Unfortunately, what I never thought I'd ever have to deal with is the fact that one of my children is so fragile. And with Duchenne muscle dystrophy, it's a rare disease. And on its own, my son his immune system is already compromised. And on top of that, he has to take certain medications that also suppress his immune system. So I'm having to, although I have the ability to reach out, I have family members and a community and a great group of doctors, it's very emotional. and it's very heartbreaking. And for my son, I want to give him everything, just like any other parent would want to do. And right now, the decision to go to school I've made at the end of summer here was one of the harder decisions I've had to make. And I know there's going to be more, but it's a life or death decision. But what has been happening over these several months is I've watched my son cry and scream and beg me to see his friends, to see his family, and it was heartbreaking. And that alone was like, you need to be in school, and this is really your chance. And another part of the disease that he has is his life expectancy doesn't look like my other children. The life expectancy for a boy with Duchenne muscular dystrophy is 24 years old. So I got to really consider all those things and give him the best life that he can have and the best quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And as a reminder, if you have a question, please feel free to drop it into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We will be collecting those questions throughout, and we'll be addressing them at the end. And finally, I'd love to introduce Sarah Smalls. Mrs. Smalls lives in Northern Virginia and is raising her 3 teen grandchildren and is an advocate for kinship caregivers and their families. She's also a Generations United Grand Family member and a member of the Federal Advisory Council supporting grandparents raising their grandchildren. Sarah, the floor is yours. And just, Sarah, if you would unmute your line, please.
I'm so sorry. Hello, everybody. As Manny said, I'm raising my 3 grandchildren. They're all teens, and this has been an adventure. I've had my grandchildren since they were at a young age. My granddaughter, who is the oldest, I've had her since she's a little over 18 months. She's now 19 she has special needs. And then I have my grandson, who is 16, who has a learning disability. And last but not least, the youngest one is 15. I'm concerned, and I should say thank you, Gail and Marissa. It's good to hear your peers. My concern is with the learning disability and the special needs, that these children will regress rather than progress with virtual learning. In my area, they decided that the first semester will be, or the first quarter will be virtual. We did have a choice prior to that, and we chose that they would go to school 2 days a week, etc., reluctantly, but they bombarded us with requests to go to school. They don't like it either. They don't like virtual learning. It's emotionally tiring. They don't get to connect with their teachers. And the concern when you have a child who has special needs is what happens to their educational plan, their individual educational plan. I have 2 who are on that. And there's no answer to that. There's no answer about whether or not, how are you going to plan for that? How are you going to explain what needs to be done, how it needs to be done when we're all learning virtually? I think the other thing that concerns me is the schedule went out of the window once this all started. Kids need a schedule, and we have no real schedule, not any that I feel is a schedule. I mean, kids go to bed late, and they get up late. So getting them on a routine so that they can learn and have a healthy background in order to learn is very difficult. I also think that the loss of disconnect with their teachers, the relationship that they have with their teachers suffers. And I too, like Gail, have a poor immune system. It's been difficult to stay in the house or to even think about sending them somewhere because you don't know what they'll come back with. And during this time, it's hard to keep 3 teens in the house at all times. Actually, 2 of them work part-time, so they have to go out. And of course, we teach them about being safe. The other thing that really concerns me is how this affects their mental health. I've seen they get very bored, and when they get bored, they do things and say things and participate in things that you wish they would not. Too much access to social media, which we all know can be troubling. I think they feel this is the only way that I can stay in touch with my friends because they don't get to see them as often. We're having to employ a tutor for those subjects that we don't feel they're up to par in. That costs money. And like Gail, my kids have never been through the system, so I get no financial assistance from anybody. And as Jaya said, it's tap into your 401k until you feel like you can't tap into it anymore. And I think last but not least, my concern as a parent of color is that the teachers are working with what they have to work with. But when you don't know, when you're not seeing this person, or you don't know who you're teaching, and you send home videos, or they have to watch certain videos, they have to do certain things, you don't know if you're traumatizing this child all over again with certain things. And with the climate that we've been in lately, you have to be very, very careful about somebody's mental state. So I feel that virtual it's not nearly the best. Even the kids don't like it. As I said, it's not nearly the best thing for the kids. We have to do what we have to do. And of course we will participate, but I think there's a lot to be thought about. I don't know if the teachers are aware of the fact that these children live with their grandparents. These are not teachers that they've had last year or the year before. Do they know that these kids live with their grandparents? And do they know that this family is a family of color? Do they know that the children may, if they have to go out for some reason, that they're exposing their grandparents to COVID? It's hard enough. And I learned this from my oldest one, being raised by your grandparent. I didn't know until she was much older that she was teased because she wasn't being raised by her parents through no fault of her own. But she always felt like there was something lacking because her parents were not with her. So as Jaya said, many of these children have trauma, In fact, that's the reason we're raising them. There's some reason why their parents cannot care for them. So there's so much that you have to be, as Gail said, therapist, teacher, all the other things that go along with just being a parent. You're not just a parent, you walk both sides of that fence. You're the grandparent who wants to hug and kiss them and say, it's okay, it's going to be okay, and I'll let you do that. But then there's the other side where you are a parent and you're responsible for these children's lives when they get older. And you have to realize that you need to bring them up to take care of themselves and be self-sufficient. So it's not always easy to hug and kiss them and say, it's okay, you know, Grammy will take care of it. That's not always what we can do. And then there's the isolation that you feel as a grandparent, because most of my friends are not raising children at this age. I'm 73 at this point, and my friends are not raising children. The support groups help, but now they're gone, and they're virtual, you know, and that's not quite the same, you know. So there are lots of issues that grandparents raising grandchildren have, and I hope that some of this has been helpful for you to hear.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So that concludes the prepared remarks portion of today's call. As a reminder, to ask a question, please write your question into the chat box and include your name and media outlet. We do have a couple of questions that have already populated, and our first question comes from Megan Kahn with The Imprint. Megan's question is around students who receive special education services. The question is, for students who typically receive special education services at school, are schools providing support to access these services from home? Maybe, Marissa, we can start that question off with you. In your experience,
Sure.
what have you been experiencing from schools?
Sure. So our experience has been, at the beginning, it was really delayed. Like everybody was like, what do we do? How do we handle this? How do we prepare for it? And then all of a sudden it really turned into a good experience for us, because like I had mentioned earlier, is that we're in the area that I live in, like, you know, and plus we're being quarantined to be safe. I welcomed virtual meetings. So what the school set up for us, so my son gets OT, PT, and speech, was we just arranged to meet through Google Meeting. And that worked out great for us. My son really liked the responsibility of knowing that he could expect that on certain days. He really likes a lot of routine, just like most children with special needs. And so we really welcomed it, and we had a positive experience with it. And they actually kept those services going throughout the summer. Unfortunately, that's where it wasn't that great. They wanted us to drive. It was like 2-hour round trip, and we were just kind of like, nah. We tried it out, and we tried to work out doing something virtually, and we've just hit a lot of bumps in the road on that one. But overall, I'd say it's a positive experience, and I guess as long as, you know, our laptop keeps working, you know, it's going to keep working for us.
And as a follow-up to that, for those caregivers on the call, have any of you also just received materials from your school district or school in order to help support education from home, either hotspots or Chromebooks or any other materials like that?
This is Gail. I'd kind of like to address this question because it's very dear to my heart. I will tell you, most of the people, at least in our county, in our state, are receiving Chromebooks. The schools are doing very well. It is not necessarily all students. As far as my experience with special education, I sit on a SEAC council, Special Education Advisory Council, for my county. And we are finding that those children, especially children like mine with cognitive function disorder, they aren't able to be on those Chromebooks that they have. They don't like seeing themselves. It's a very much of a challenge for them to be on virtual. For counseling, therapy, everything, it's very difficult for them. In the beginning, in March, they provided Chromebooks for the children. They had the teacher, the special education teacher, did a 30-minute check-in, but there was no interaction. And we have learned that in order to teach children, we need to have interaction. You can't just put something out there on the Chromebook and say, here, do the homework. The teachers need to interact with these children. If you've got a child who can't see that screen or won't look at that screen, that's really difficult to do. So starting in March, they were not able to provide educational material to special education children, especially those who could not sit still, those with ADHD, they couldn't sit still. So now, starting the new school year, they delayed school for about 2 weeks, and we're doing it virtually. They still have not figured out what they're doing for those children who are in a special education classroom. Our little boy generally goes to a classroom of only 5 children so that he can get that one-on-one attention. Virtually, that person is going to be me.
Thank you for sharing that, Gail. Our next question comes from Stell Simonton with Youth Today. The question is for Sarah. Stell wants to know, did you say that you had borrowed from your 401k since the pandemic began? And then your grandkids, have they started school already this fall? She would also like to know, Sarah, where you live.
I live in Fairfax County. My kids attend Fairfax County schools. They're both in the 11th grade, but one goes to one school, one goes to another. And yes, I have had to borrow from my 401k.
And
there are 3 of them, 2 boys. They eat a lot.
And have your grandchildren started school yet this year?
No, they don't start until September 8th. And it will be virtual.
And still as a follow-up question, and Jaya, maybe you can take this one on. The question is, what are some of the solutions to the problems that we've described here? So what would Generations United like to see in terms of assistance to grandparents raising their grandchildren?
Yeah, I can start, and I encourage caregivers to speak up as well. But certainly, one of the things that we have been advocating for is federal investments in kinship navigator programs. And those are one-stop shop or information and referral programs that help connect families to supports and services, kinship families. And, you know, the best versions of those programs also operate support groups and do the full range of wraparound services for families. So they would be equipped in times like this to help deliver food to families, to make sure that they're helping families get the support they need at home to support their children's education, etc. And we know that as states are cash strapped, that a federal investment in programs like that is really important. But we also want to really encourage states and tribes that are operating those programs to reach out to the full range of families, not just those that come in contact with the child welfare system, but those that never connected with the child welfare system, as I know that Gail and Sarah alluded to is the case with their families. There's also a need for investments in other systems with a special call out to grandfamilies. So we know that TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, is a critical source of support for many grandfamilies that don't connect with child welfare. So dollars that go to TANF, and really encouraging states to make it easy to apply for those dollars, a clear process so that they can get that financial support. Access to food and nutrition is really critical right now. Some of the processes for getting that food, you know, it requires families to leave their home, to wait in long lines, and then sometimes get to the end of the line and the food's gone, come back tomorrow. So really making clear, streamlined processes, and also so that they don't have to go to a different line to get food for the child versus the adult. We've had states where that's the case. Also really want to flag for aging services. We know that the CARES Act, there's been some investment in additional dollars going to area agencies on aging. And those programs can use their dollars, their National Family Caregiver Support Program dollars, to serve grandfamilies, but it is up to them. And so we really encourage those aging services to use those dollars to serve grandfamilies, and encourage grandfamilies to contact those programs to say, look, I understand you have resources and we need support. And then there's much, but the last one that I'll flag is access to technology, because there's a need for technology assistance, financial help to get the technology in the home, and then how to operate the technology and connect folks through technology to telehealth, to support groups and different systems. So that's a start, and if you want more, I'm happy to follow up with a full list of recommendations.
Great, and we're also happy to pass that along, Stell. Anything that our caregivers would like to add to the question?
Yes, this is Gail. I also want people to understand that for every child that is in the child welfare system, been involved with child welfare, there are 12 children that are not involved with child welfare. That means that they do not get the financial support. So like Sarah was saying, she's drawn from her 401k. Many of our grandfamilies from the very beginning, the minute they take on their children, because they are not certified, have had to draw on their 401k. I myself also have to continue to work on in past 60 because I do not have the financial support to raise that child. And also to Jaya's point, also the TANF, most of our grandparents, I can't remember what the statistics are. Not very many of our grandparents actually access TANF because they are afraid that it will impact their children not being able to pay their own rent and having to take their children, the biological parents, back in. So again, that becomes another financial situation that I think our legislation needs to take a look at.
Great. Thank you so much, Gail.
Manny, I think having advocated for kinship for over the last 15 years or so, it's almost like a vicious cycle, especially if you're not in the child welfare system. Everything you do for your child, you have to do it. They need a therapist, you have to pay out of pocket for that, or health insurance. I'm going to give you just a quick story of a lady who was about to retire from the federal government. She and her husband had decided to 6 months in Caribbean, 6 months in the States, and had their plans in motion, etc. And along comes a grandchild who was at risk. What to do? And you constantly see this child is at risk. Can you turn your back and say, I'm going on with my retirement and I'm going to live in the Caribbean 6 months and come back to the States 6 months? Or do and say, okay, so that's their kid. And if they have to go to foster care, they have to go to foster care. Not the greatest thing in the world. And that person was me. We had to do what we had to do. So no Caribbean for 6 months. We're here in the States with 3 grandchildren, where you have to have a system, you have to raise them, you have to have some continuity for them. So that's happens, and it's not just me, it happens frequently, But that's how close you can get. And I'm sure Gail knows, and Marissa as well,
Thank you for sharing that, Sarah.
I'd like to add something really quick to that. So as far as assistance for grandparents and relative caregivers, I would definitely like to see, so I know Gail had mentioned she's working full-time and I'm working full-time also. I took work off. I took 11 weeks of work off, so I utilized family medical leave. And so I would like to see some type of paid leave that supports us. I'm sure I'm not the only one that's a single parent, the only one that's working full time. We need that extra help, because if, the child care centers are closed and the schools are closed, what are we gonna do? And also that just leads into also childcare, helping fund childcare and get us some really good quality people that can help us, and also for respite care. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marissa. We'll take one more question, and it comes from Erin Richards from USA Today. Erin asks, I'm not sure the types of school districts your grandchildren all attended, but do you feel like they have enough resources, either money, staffing, support, qualified teachers, PPE, if they're heading back in person, to serve your grandchildren's needs, or the children that you are caring for's needs? If not, what is missing? So maybe for this question, we'd love to hear from our caregivers about what you feel is missing in terms of what your school districts are providing, the types of services and resources your school districts are providing. And then Jaya, maybe you can jump in at the end just to kind of provide nationally what you're hearing, maybe around what schools are being provided and how schools are supporting caregivers. So we'd love to start with some of our caregivers.
Manny, I'll start. Because I live in Fairfax County, we're one of the top schools in the nation. And no, I do not feel they're ready. There's a lot of disparity. From one school, I get sufficient information. From another school, I don't get very much information. And as I said before, I'm really concerned about children with special needs, learning disabilities, ADD. They have what's called an IEP, and it's an informational educational plan that you should be working with in order to educate the child. It's an individual educational plan. We've not had that since COVID-19. There's no way that they can follow it because it's not in existence. As for whether or not the schools have all of the equipment that is needed and et cetera, I haven't heard that they do. They've been closing down schools in order to clean them, and said that they would be ready initially, but then they decided that no, we're not going to take the chance and we're going to go virtual, but there's a lot lacking that you get when you are in school in person. So that's my take on it. And as I said before, we're one of the top schools in the nation in Fairfax County. So I expect more.
Thank you, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
Gail?
Yeah, I can tell you, it's really interesting because we get notification from the school and it changes literally on a day-by-day basis. One day we're going back to school, the next day we're delaying school for 2 weeks, the next day we're not going to school, and we're not getting answers. We're asking about, are our teachers coming back to school? And the school union is fighting coming back to school. So if we don't have enough teachers, no, we're not going to be able to support these kids. And again, like Sarah says, when it comes to children with IEPs or special education plans, there is no plan. They tell us all the time, we don't know. We are literally in a pandemic that is a FEMA crisis, and we don't know how to handle it, and neither does the school.
Right. Our school district is not prepared. I feel that they're not prepared. They have had several meetings. School is due to start next week. My son will be entering kindergarten, and kindergarten will start the week after that on August 31st. I did attend a school board meeting last week, and it was pretty chaotic. They kind of had a plan written out, but it looks like, just like Gail said, it's just ever changing daily. Something new's coming up. But I would like to just stress, and I'm going to continue to push this message out throughout our community, is the fact that our special needs children cannot be forgotten. And our most vulnerable families, I live right next to the reservation here, and just the Native kids, they're a vulnerable group too. It's like, do not forget about us. We're here. And all these special needs children, the best place for them to be is face-to-face at school. So somebody should be working towards that and really make that a priority. I didn't, at the last school board meeting I attended, I did not hear that topic come up. And none of the parents were able to make comments or ask questions. So I did type it out, and I ended up sending an email, but it's just really crazy. I kind of feel like people are afraid to say the wrong thing and do the wrong thing, but it's just kind of like we're all in this together, and we need to be open to new ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Jaya, is there anything you'd like to add to that last question from Erin?
Just say, I think you got a snapshot that what we're seeing across the country is a lot of uncertainty as schools are trying to make decisions. There's moving targets, and it really is kind of all over the map, depending on different parts of the country in terms of what schools are deciding to do and how many resources they have. But on the whole, what we see is schools are so concerned about trying to get the basics to everyone that we are concerned that thinking about grandfamilies and children with special needs and their special concerns may be left behind. So just really want to elevate, don't forget about the grandfamilies and the special circumstances that grandfamilies are facing, and also to really urge schools to be looking at how to partner with organizations in the communities that are experienced and know how to work with and effectively serve grandfamilies. And among those, I would really elevate area agencies on aging. They're going to particularly focus on those older caregivers, but many programs there have good resources. They have opportunities to partner. So really be looking at what programs in your community are already serving families. And we have a list at grandfactsheets.org of state-by-state resources for grandfamilies. So that's a place that schools can look for where to partner.
Great, thank you, Jaya. And that concludes today's call. Thank you all for joining this briefing. If you were unable to get your questions asked, or if you have any follow-up questions or would like to set up an interview with any of our call participants, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can contact the email and phone number on the media advisory that you received that was advising this call. And again, that concludes our call today. Thank you and have a wonderful day. You may now disconnect.